Hi, everyone. Thank you all for coming out tonight. It's not loud enough. It's on. My name's Christina, and I'm the events coordinator here at Books Are Magic. Before we get started, I wanted to point out some logistics for how tonight's going to go. We'll be doing a hand-raised audience Q&A towards the end of the event, so start thinking of questions to ask now. After the talk tonight, Mark will be signing and personalizing books at the desk near where you checked in. We also have additional books available to purchase from my colleagues at the register. If you're joining us virtually on the live stream, we'd love to encourage you to buy a copy of the Fabulist online using the link in the live stream description. It's a pleasure to have Mark Chiusano and Matt Flegenheimer here to discuss one of the most controversial characters in recent years. Lies, deceit, confusion, and maybe drag queens fill this book to the brim, combining the very best of boots-on-the-ground journalism, dishy backroom dealings, and much more that will feel just as at home in your next summer beach read. The Fabulist is truly stranger than fiction. Mark Chiusano covered George Santos as a columnist and editorial writer at Newsday. As the youngest editorial writer in the paper's history, he interviewed national leaders, tracked and wrote along with far-right patriot groups and fringe left activists, and traveled from New Hampshire to Puerto Rico to tell the story of American politics on the ground. He's also a New York City native and author of the story collection Marine Park. Mark will be joined in conversation tonight by Matt Flegenheimer. Matt Flegenheimer is a reporter covering national politics. He started at the Times in 2011 on the Metro desk covering transit, city hall, and campaigns. He's a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania and a lifelong New Yorker. Let's all give a very warm welcome to Mark and Matt.
Thank you. Listening to those bios, the important thing is that we're both lifelong New Yorkers,
Obviously.
really. Yeah, clearly.
As if there's any other place to be.
Right, yeah.
Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you to Books Are Magic for having us. Thank you to Mark for writing a fantastic book that gives us a reason to gather on a Wednesday evening in January. Again, buy the book if you haven't. Buy 5. Hand Mark an envelope stuffed with cash, whatever it takes.
It's like a wedding, basically.
Or
Italian wedding.
Or catch them on Cameo. You on Cameo?
That's right, yeah. Not yet.
So I guess I'd love to start off in my janky reporter's notebook here. Obviously, a book is a commitment, and spending this much time with the subject is a commitment. I'm curious obviously you had this background covering Long Island politics and Santos in particular. What compelled you to decide to spend a year of your life in this world and making sense of this world?
Yeah, no, it is a commitment. And I'm just thinking, my parents are here and my brother's here. Shout out my parents. They're the...
Shout out Mark's parents.
Yeah. But they were, the babysitters for me this whole time. So it was a commitment because someone had to babysit too. And so I appreciate them. It was a lot of work, and it was crazy to be doing this with a 1.5-year-old. I don't recommend. Not the ideal way to write a book, but that's what journalism demanded. No, I mean, it's a little bit of right place, right time. I was writing for Newsday at the time and kind of knew the background and had interviewed him a bunch of times and sort of knew what was going on with him. But beyond that, I think after the Times' great story came out, which sort of connected all the dots about who this guy is, at first I was like, I know this guy really well. Should I try to do a book proposal about him? Whatever. It's like a flash in the pan. And I kind of thought I'll just let it lie, whatever, move on to a different story. But then, first of all, he keeps doing kind of outrageous things. He gets seated, right? He gets seated in Congress in this kind of wild way that was somewhat indicative of how tight how tight a majority the Republicans had. And then he continues to do kind of crazy things, even more sort of outrageous stuff. And then he doesn't get kicked out, right? That he's just committing to lying, stealing, grifting, hustling, etc. And no one can push him out. And that's kind of when I thought this story, A, is not really going anywhere, and B, says something, I think, larger about where we are in American politics right now. And that's when I sort of said, okay, I really want to do this.
My wife, Alexis, who is here, has a line that I like when I'm working on kind of a longer story, that the subject sort of moves in with you, becomes a roommate, So I ask you, and I guess we should ask Charlotte too. What is George Santos like as a roommate?
Yeah, I mean, he's one of the worst roommates of all time in real life, right? Like, he's just absolute stealing. That so in the book there's a chapter about roommates. It's called Grift City, and it's basically his like roommates in New York. And that was to me like the most fun chapter, right? I don't know if it's the best chapter in the book, but it was definitely the most fun to do. Yeah. But because there are just like a lot of roommates who were super willing to talk, because he had just like done the craziest stuff, and just stolen so much from them. I mean, one of my favorite finds of the book, because so much of George Santos has come out in so many ways, like the whole like reporting universe was like jumped on him, right? So he's been like very picked to the bone. But one of my favorite finds in this book was a 16-year-old roommate who was like a kid, friend of the family, who moves in, friend of his sister's really. And he's in like high school. I think he wasn't even at the grade level that he should have been at 16. So he's like a young guy, doesn't speak any English full. Comes over and sort of sees Santos as an older brother figure, is really like looking up to him. And at first Santos does. By the way, this guy was the origin of some like great details about Santos, like the fact that he snores and talks in his sleep, which was just like so intimate. I was like, how is this happening that I know about this right now? And then of course the moral of the story is that the kid wants to buy some iPads and other like, video game kind of stuff to send back home to Brazil. And Santos, of course, has a scam with that. He's like, I'll buy them for you with my credit card and then you can pay me in cash. What do we think happened? Santos took the money. None of this stuff shows up. And I saw, this guy sent me the receipts and everything. And it's really sad because then he, goes back to Brazil penniless. This was all the money he saved that Santos took from him. Never comes back to the U.S. again. His American dream is over. This is like kind of what Santos did to his roommates and everyone around him. But, it is like, I'm thinking about the roommate thing. So that's like his actual roommates. In terms of the roommate in my head, it was weirdly intimate, like someone sent me a picture of his actual passport, like with all the numbers and everything. And I was like, I don't know what to do with this. Like, do I want to confirm that I received this? Like in case someone does identity theft. I did not, Representative, I did not identity thieve you, but I have the photo, and someone sent me a picture of him naked in a bath, in a bubble bath, like, it's like, what am I supposed to do with this? It's just it's very strange being so like in one way close to this guy and in another way very, very far, right? Because he refused to talk to me once I started working on the book and has been very sort of angry about it in many ways.
I'm so curious, and we touched on some of those details, the passports, the bubble baths. What kind of reporting went into this? Obviously, you traveled far and wide. You delved obviously deeper into the Long Island scene that you knew well. At the front end of this project, what did you sort of see as kind of the key reporting buckets that you wanted to make sure you were hitting?
So I wanted to make sure I talked to everyone who had talked publicly about Santos. That was kind of like the first part. And I thought that was going to be easy. That ended up being, in some ways, some of the harder parts of this story because there developed this sort of George Santos cottage industry where everyone felt that, they owned a piece of this story, the people who were a part of it, I mean. And so that they wanted to sell their story often, which, is an interesting philosophical question. It's like obviously where, there is... I'm gaining something from telling this story, right? And they are, not getting anything for telling their story in return. So it's an interesting ethical question, but just because of the standards of American journalism, I just refuse to pay for any information, right? So it was difficult to encourage to sort of make sure people were telling me the truth and sort of get the stories that were already out there. That was one bucket. Another bucket was sort of like freedom of information requests and just sort of like public record requests to find as much information like that I could of the ways he touched public records in some ways, whether courts or old credit card bills. For example, I found one of the only ways that his husband has sort of touched public records is because Santos was, very late on a credit card bill and was actually served for it, like a summons. And his husband answers the door, and the person who filed served the summons, the paperwork, had to describe his husband. So it said, I forget exactly what it was, but like height, weight, body type. So interesting. Again, this like intimacy, very strange. The other bucket, which we've talked about a bit, was social media. Very, very helpful. Oh, and of course, I talked to just anyone who knew him, who hadn't talked to the press before. That's like, over 100 interviews with people, 100 people interviewed. And then social media, which ended up being very useful because I was thinking about this recently. Like, I think that social media helps you write a biography of someone that's not authorized in a way that would have been more difficult in the past, right? Like, you usually have to rely on letters, diaries, things that the subject has to give you, right? And that's why we have this long tradition of semi-authorized biographies. And lots of problems with that, as you might imagine, right? That there's a level of that's almost a deal that you're striking with the subject. I had to strike no such deal with George Santos, which was very freeing. But he still left a real trail of information behind him on social media. Some of it minor, it's not like there was a huge like gotcha that he left on social media. Most of the like very gotcha stuff he's deleted by now. But just things like, I found a video of him. This wasn't even from him. This was someone else had posted a video of him, knee deep in snow out on Long Island during the campaign, chanting about like, unmask my children, stuff like that. So like you could really get he has no kids. But you can really get like a sense of who this person is and sort of what they're doing on a daily basis, even if they weren't talking to you back in, whatever it was, 2017, 2018.
No, we were talking about this week. It is so striking that in some ways social media becomes a more reliable narrator, particularly in a story like this, at least to sort of build a timeline and establish coordinates of somebody in Brazil and New York over the years. And it does feel like that really helped you kind of build a timeline in some ways.
Especially for someone who didn't necessarily originally expect to be a public figure, right? So he wasn't, in the beginning, he wasn't really censoring himself. Actually, he's never really, he doesn't really censor himself generally, but, there was a real nice cache of tweets and stuff that came from when he was kind of going back and forth from Brazil, like pre-politics days, that really showed what he was fascinated with, which was basically like Miley Cyrus, celebrity, skin smoothness. Like this is what he was into, before politics. Shout out hand cream and stuff. Like that's what he wanted.
Shout out hand cream and Mark's parents again.
Yeah.
I feel like just sort of reading this as a writer and reporter, the thought I had coming in was this tone's going to be really tricky because so many of the particulars of the story are so farcical and absurd and objectively funny. And the sort of thesis you build to in the accumulation of those details is quite serious in some ways. I guess I'm curious to hear just sort of how you tried to balance keeping a tone that was true to the subject while also never losing sight of kind of the higher order kind of conclusions you're trying to draw.
Totally. And Matt, by the way, is a master of tone in his stories. So it's a good question. But I think that it was tricky because you both don't want to I think there is a way that some of the talking about Santos and mostly just sort of like social media chatter about Santos can get homophobic in a way, right? And there's a way that it can be sort of, he's slandered for things because he himself opens himself up to slander, right? It's not surprising. That being said, I wanted to sort of avoid, making light of things because he was an elected member of Congress. There's only been, I knew the number at one point, but it's like 10,000 or something members of Congress in history. It's not a ton, right? So he is a serious figure. He's a figure of some substance by virtue of being elected. And he left this trail of victims behind him. So you don't want to sort of make light of these people who were really, really affected by him. That being said, it's a fun story. And so what I kind of landed on I sort of looked to some other models that I thought worked and kind of did this well. One of which is like Goodfellas, right? I actually think that kind of nails the tone, and because it's a mob movie, right? Does anyone need me to rehash Goodfellas?
I'd actually love to hear you recapping Goodfellas.
Shout out Goodfellas, yeah. But I think that Scorsese very definitely, shows obviously the bad parts of the mob and the murder and victims and everything, as well as sort of bringing you on this kind of crazy adventure. And I think the key there is the rise and fall too, right? And that's what sort of drew me to Santos too, is this like rapid rise, and then his like white knuckled death grip to his end.
I had not thought about the Goodfellas. That's so interesting, because it does sort of, not the Scorsese's plane, but it does feel like a lot of the arc of that movie, or like a Wolf of Wall Street, is sort
totally
of
Wolf of Wall Street,
this kind of rollicking first half, and then you have to sit with sort of the consequences of like why you felt that way for the rest of the movie.
Right, there's like a real morality to Scorsese, right?
Yeah, that's really interesting. Were there any details that you were sort of encountering in the reporting and thinking like that can't possibly be true, and then it actually came to pass that that's the thing that happened?
So many. This is the crazy thing about the Santos experience, is you have to double and triple check everything. But there were some pieces I was really fascinated with his early life, maybe because he's a New Yorker and I'm sort of familiar with the New York world that he grew up in. And so there were some pieces that I just like loved and was kind of obsessed with. One of which was that his mother, is immigrant from Brazil, comes to the U.S., is working various jobs, mostly in people's houses. And one of those jobs ends up being a house cleaner to the family that basically started Marvel Comics, right? So like the, Spider-Man, whatever, all these just like these sort of classic American characters. And it's just like such a kind of funny high-low moment in the way America works, that she's like cleaning, she's kind of, polishing the whatever Oscars or whatever awards are in this house. And her son is, yet to be born, is going to become this figure, this American figure himself. I also was really interested in the fact that his aunt, a lot of his family worked in people's houses like this, something that he always sort of would lie about, right? Which I think was interesting psychologically. But his aunt, I was told, worked for some people very high up in the business world, again, like as a kind of like person running your household. And I thought that was interesting because it shows, again, that high-low of like where Santos kind of rubbed up against the great heights of American society, and like wanted that, and kind of wanted more than he had. So those are things that I like spent a long time tracking down.
I was so struck by, particularly in the section of the book about his time in Brazil, how you sort of built these worlds out and tried to make sense of, even if you couldn't speak to him, sort of what he was inhabiting and the surroundings that he had. I'm just sort of curious to hear a little bit more about the reporting experience there on the ground.
Yeah, difficult in Brazil because I don't speak the language, and was pretty new there. Obviously, it was true definition of helicoptering in, right? So to kind of avoid making the dumbest mistakes about a culture that I am not part of, I first of all tried to do a lot of reading, nonfiction and fiction. I got really into Clarice Lispector, great Brazilian writer. There's a great epic called Macunema, which is about a kind of Brazilian trickster. It's kind of like it's this sort of legend of, some people consider it like the Brazilian epic. And it's about a sort of shape-shifting figure who just runs through different parts of Brazil, and both like very chaotic, both having a lot of fun and getting into a lot of trouble. Obvious parallels to Santos there. So that helped to sort of get a sense, at least a piece of a sense of the culture. And I just did lots of interviews. I had a great translator who's actually a sports reporter down there, which was very helpful. I'd never really worked with a translator before, but he was great and had a real kind of like sports reporter swagger. He just kind of, it didn't matter who he was talking to. He would just he could always establish a rapport really nicely. So that was great. The one place that my translator abandoned me was at the the sex club that I had to go to.
Had to go to.
Yeah, had to. To be clear, my wife went as well. We went together. We had a babysitter for our daughter. She was like, I want to check this out. And she was not allowed to go in because you had to be a man to go in, or a man in street clothes. So I went to this club. My translator was like, yeah, I'm busy tonight, bro. Sorry. So I'm there alone without any language help. They hand you a key that you can use to like unlock a door to have sex with someone. I didn't do that. But I did go to like watch. The reason I was there was to watch Santos's drag mentor basically like give a performance, which I was really excited to do. Was really lucky to be there in that time. It took a long time to convince this drag mentor to let me come see her and to tell me where it would be and everything. Because there's not a ton of direct evidence of what Santos looked like in drag, right? This was one of the most kind of lurid and fun details and like claims that came out about Santos, right? And he's certainly dressed in drag. I mean, there's pictures and video, but they don't cover a wide period. So that required a lot more reporting to see like how much did he actually dress in drag. And beyond that sort of, basic question, what was the point of this? Like why was he dressing in drag? And that I think I sort of got, again, scratched more towards an answer to when you actually see it in person, because you're in this sex club and most of the performers are stripping and whatever, coming into the audience and asking for tips. I was like, I don't speak Portuguese, I'm so sorry. That's the problem. That's why I can't give you a tip. I had like a pad like this. I was actually sitting much like this. I was kind of like, taking notes.
I'm sure they love that.
Yeah, they love that. They're like, what is this dude doing here? But then his drag mentor comes on, and she's older. She's dressed in this kind of like beautiful dress, a beautiful wig. And you kind of get the sense that, like this is not about sex. It's not about, that's sort of not what's going on in her head at all. It's about like beauty and entertainment and sort of transforming yourself. She was telling me earlier that, in the sort of this older community of drag performers in Brazil actually calls themselves transformistas, which I think is like a really beautiful phrase. And so then I sort of was like, this is kind of what was going on with Santos, was that he, wanted to sort of change his circumstances, his appearance. He's obviously obsessed with his appearance. And so maybe that is one explanation for what he was doing there.
Are there particular moments in his arc prior to politics where you feel like he got away with something that maybe surprised him and kind of showed him what he could get away with even at higher rungs of society?
Definitely. I mean, this was kind of the problem, that he did get away with so much and was never really caught, right? And so one of the chapters that I liked the most in the book is this. It's kind of like, I thought of it as the like dividing moment. Again, if we have the sort of Scorsese arc, to me, this chapter was like, this is where it all turns. And it's the chapter where like I kind of look into this question of why did he choose politics, because it doesn't make any sense, right? Like, why would you that you have this long history of scamming and hustling. Why would you that you are doing sketchy things? Why do you decide to open yourself up to public attention? And I think that it's a couple of things. Part of it is that he had gone so long without getting caught. But also this was this like sort of defining moment. This was this like this was this moment in American culture where everyone was interested in politics, right? And this was like the place to be. This was the thing that people were talking about. And he is the kind of guy who wants to be at the center, wants to be kind of, in the like pulsing heart of the culture. And so when it was politics, he chose politics. It's interesting to me as a kind of thought experiment what he would have been maybe in a different era. If you look at the sort of history of scammers, the ones that we remember are often, the ones that are like, catch their moment like that. And so I wonder, would he have been like a Silicon Valley scammer or a, whatever, different kind of hustler? But because we are in this political moment, I think he chose politics.
There's a line in there that essentially politics he found quickly was another field where lying worked out just fine.
Right.
What were the implications of that epiphany for him as he seemed to kind of recognize what he could get away with at this level?
He did seem to sort of iterate. He was moving fast and breaking things. Because it's funny again to sort of trace the lies with him, because most of us kind of know the top line. It's like, oh, he lied about the 9/11 thing. Like, well, like it's not exactly. It's a little more complicated than that. Well, he lied about being Jewish. He didn't start lying about being Jewish. That lie started with like a little kernel of truth. And one of his family members once told me that, with him, it's like a kernel of truth and a pebble of truth and a mountain of lies, was his line. That was true with the Jewish thing, that his family has this tradition of like, maybe we do have Jewish heritage generations back, right? Hard to prove or disprove. And certainly I found a genealogist who found like a name in I can't remember what it was, I think the 1600s, a name that was Jewish sounding, the genealogist told me, which is a hilarious, like bending over backwards to try to give Santos his due. But, that was how he told the story originally about being Jewish. And then it would shift a little bit. Then, the war in Ukraine happened, and he starts talking about his Ukrainian ties and the Ukrainian Jewish ties. And then, someone sort of, is criticizing him on social media, and he starts talking about his Holocaust ties. And so he clearly sees, A, that he's not getting caught, and B, that there is that he gains something from these lies. It's a district with a large Jewish population. He would tell these lies about being Jewish, or like the level of his Jewishness at fundraisers that are with Jewish groups, right? And so clearly I think that these lies escalated over time, and I tried to kind of track that in the book, like how they snowballed for him.
As you mentioned, he obviously did not engage with you for the book itself. If he were here in this chair, with his perfect skin,
right,
what would you ask him?
Wow. I thought about this a lot because obviously I called him many times and sent him texts and emails and stuff. Did I send him an email? I can't remember. I don't know if I had a good email for him, but I knew what his phone number was because he has picked up before. And I thought about that because I wasn't sure what was going to happen. I wondered if he would sort of be angry at first, but then talk to me, because why not? He likes to talk. So I wanted to be prepared, and I had like a list of things that I was going to hit him with, because I figured I only had like one or two, questions that he would answer. So I remember my like list. Some of the times I would call. A few of them were like specifics. Like I mentioned, I was fascinated with this question about his aunt working in the. I couldn't confirm the exact person that she worked for, but I have a hunch of who it is. And I wanted to like try to confirm that. So that was one of my questions I was going to throw at him and see if he would just like blurt out the answer. Because I think it's just interesting to show like how he developed, what was in his head. And then the one like psychological question that I was going to ask him, I can't remember the exact phrasing, but it was something to the effect of like, why did you choose politics? Because I thought that maybe that would be something he'd answer, or at least not dismiss out of hand. And I thought that maybe it would be telling. But this is the problem with this whole exercise, was that what could I trust of what he said, right? Like, what was I gonna, if he had spoken to me, how could I have used that? And I think you could only kind of use that sort of psychological answer, which again is probably not true, but at least there's only one source on that, so I thought that might have been interesting. By the way, he did pick up the phone once for the book process, because I called from a different phone number. Little tricky, but sometimes it works. And he immediately hung up, and then he called me right back and started just like yelling at me and threatening to call the cops and stuff, and wouldn't answer any questions. But he was very aware of the book. He also texted back and forth about, again, sort of criticizing me and being very angry. So I don't think I would get a word in edgewise if he was here. Yeah.
There you go. I'm sure you saw this. Maybe some folks in the crowd did as well. He spoke to Z-Way recently. And the sort of crucial exchange where he seemed to really kind of get the better of her. was she asked some version of like, what will it take for us to make
Yeah.
you go away? And he says, stop inviting me to your platforms.
Yeah.
But you can't because you need the content.
It's so true.
And it felt like such a central insight into this moment, culturally, politically, and a lot of the conclusions that you reach in the book, even prior to these last couple of months that we've seen from him. But what does he sort of understand about this moment that maybe others in politics don't?
Yeah. Well, I think he's very charismatic, which you see in that interview, and just generally. He's actually kind of very good at that very basic level of politics. And I think he understood that you could, that entertainment is kind of all that matters, you know, and that people were not really looking into his kind of background and his like policy positions. He used policy positions mostly as signifiers, right? Just as sort of saying like, oh, I'm on your team on this. But other than like signaling that he was on your team, he just wanted you to be sort of entertained. And he was very good at that. And some politics, you know, this is like not new to politics. People have done this for a long time. But I think what is somewhat new with him is that he's a guy who, you know, came from absolutely nowhere and was really good at using social media and lying to get ahead, right? Like he just had no compunction at all about saying, you know, whatever he needed to the audience that he was speaking to. It's very rare for him to sort of say like, well, I disagree with you on that. You really didn't hear that on the campaign trail with him. And he understands that we have very short attention spans and we're not paying attention as much as we should. And that has benefited him. We'll see what happens. Obviously, he himself has a lot of legal challenges and is facing, you know, lots of years in prison at the least. But I think the larger question is like, what happens after that? You know, do we have a different type of candidate that, you know, is this like a post-Watergate moment where we are like more careful with candidate resumes? Or is he kind of just the beginning of all this, the beginning of these kind of social media era candidates who really just care about fundraising and being sort of ridiculous on a national level and reaping the rewards for that. So that's kind of an open question.
How are we on time? I want to leave some time for questions. And I'm seeing on your very statesman-like watch that we're heading towards half an hour here.
Yeah, the one. He has really nice watches too. I remember like. This is another funny.
This would have been a subject you could talk about.
I know. We could have talked to his watches. Someone, I got like literally multiple emails about his glasses. People were like, those glasses are fake. I'm an optometrist of 25 years service. I was like, okay, I don't know, man. I don't know how I'm going to figure that out, you know. But this guy was convinced that his glasses were fake. Who can say?
Any optometrists in the crowd who can answer this for us? Yeah, I feel like, are we in a good spot to do questions? Yeah, I mean, are there any particular details that just kind of were left on the cutting room floor that you felt like didn't fit, but were just so sort of fascinating to encounter in the process? Right.
Well, let me tell you one that I learned today, which is fun, and I don't think there's anything to really do with this. But the Cameo thing, right? Everyone's familiar with this. So I've been trying to like get the actual numbers on that, like how much he actually made, and that's been proving difficult. But apparently he did, in fact, break all the records for first day, first week, and first month of Cameo. So yeah, shout out Cameo, shout out George Santos making money. Yeah, I thought that was funny.
Have you been just crushing hours of Santos cameos on the internet?
I've kind of refused. Okay. It's like they also there was a good Amanda Hess piece about this today. Like they're really boring, you know. Like if you look at them as a critic, they're super boring. So you know they're not it's not forever.
Well, even on that sort of score, like why do you think he is somebody who Americans of, I assume, really all political backgrounds would be willing to spend some amount of money to sort of send to somebody on a lark?
Hundreds of dollars. I like really learned a lot about, you know, the monetary condition of my personal friends because no one bought me one, and everyone was like, dude, like it's like $500. Like, yeah, come on. It's like, we like you, but chill out, you know. Which I was sort of glad about. I do not want a cameo from George Santos. No, but I think that it's like it's the perfect American story. You know, we love hustler stories, we love scammer stories. The Great Gatsby is is a scammer story, and you know, this is sort of like central to our ethos that and maybe it's like sometimes I wonder if it's a consequence of our, you know, world of income inequality and you know, the difficulty in actually getting ahead. So the only way you can get ahead is to kind of fake it, right? And we love to see the fakers, especially, and this is crucial, I think, especially when they are somewhat harmless, right? As far as we know, Santos is not a violent person, is not kind of hurting people in that way. So he's left this real trail of financial victims, but a lot of it is petty and small, other than a couple of key examples. So I think we all feel okay laughing at it and saying like, well, he screwed over a lot of, you know, fancy people, so good for him. And I think that's part of the appeal.
You actually do answer this in the book, but for those who haven't gotten to it yet, of all of the particular lies, deceptions, the volleyball thing just stands out. And why volleyball? Why was that? And particularly, it's Baruch volleyball that he lies about having been a star. Like, what is it about that particular sport, that particular program that he alighted onto?
I mean, this was one of the saddest things to me. Is like when I heard the Baruch volleyball thing, I was like, I know so many people who go to Baruch. Like, let's go. I'm gonna get this story. Like, this is when I thought that he actually did go to Baruch, and I was like texting all my friends who went to Baruch, and like I was like, can you just like send me pictures, yearbooks? Like, what do you got? And everyone was like, no, like definitely did not go there. So that was sad. But no, this sad for me personally. But this was like it's a real good case study of what he does when he lies. Because it's like it does both of the things he does when he lies. One of the things he does is he'll just take from like someone's story, right? So there was an old boss that he had who was a legitimate like star at Baruch volleyball, and also Brazilian. And we don't know this for sure because Santos hasn't said it, but the similarities between the stories and their, you know, connections seem a little too good to be true. So it does seem that he like pulled some of that story from this former boss. The other thing he does is just sort of, he's like very kind of quick and clumsy on his feet, which I find very very relatable, and it feels very millennial too. He's like, you know, classic millennial. So he's on a radio program, and I forget the exact particulars, but basically like the two radio hosts are saying that I think it's their kids went to, I think it's that they went to Baruch and also played both volleyball and tennis, which he has said he played. And so he just jumps in and is like, oh yeah, like I played volleyball at Baruch. And then he starts just like scatting and iterating. And it's just like he couldn't help himself. He couldn't just say like, interesting, you know, like moving on. He had to like just make up this story. And actually there's one, you know, people just kept sending me their Santos stories even after the book. So this was one that came in too late, but I just found it so telling. This was a guy that worked with him, and he invited Santos over to his house. The guy's wife is there, and the guy's wife works at a pharmacy. She has a boss at the pharmacy, and she's talking about it, and Santos is like, oh yeah, I know that guy. And she's like, you absolutely don't. And she's like, he's like a pharmacist. And he's like, no, I know him. You know, I know him. I like, I've met him. I'm buddies with him. And she was like, okay, whatever. Like, let's let it rest. And he just like freaks out. He's like, no, I know him. And this is just like, I think that says something about what's going on in his head, that he just can't let these things go.
Obviously, he spoke about Trump being a role model for him in politics. What did he learn from Trump, and what was he sort of able to distinguish? How is he different from Trump and how he presented himself publicly? It does feel like there are sort of particular ticks that he picks up, but he's his own thing.
Yeah, I mean, he definitely picks up language from Trump. He uses some exact language. So that's, you know, he would watch Trump and sort of learn from these Trump figures. And he, you know, that was one of the fun Facebook things too, is you could see these videos of him like watching these Trump events and commenting on them. But I think the thing that's different is that Trump, in some ways, you know, if you pull back, not so surprising that Trump is a national figure, right? He's had this national TV program that, you know, half the country watched, right? He had not as much money as he claimed to have, but lots of money, had these best-selling books. Like he had his platform for politics ready. George Santos had none of those things. And so interesting, and I think somewhat sort of a cautionary tale that he himself was able to rise without any of those benefits. I think we're supposed to ask for questions.
I think it's question time. Okay. Is there a mic for the crowd, or I'll just shout them out if somebody has them. Go ahead.
Yeah. So you go.
I'm curious how you think this episode may impact the way that future election cycles are covered, because I feel like part of the narrative early on was like, part of the reason you got away with this is that, local journalism is under-resourced and too many and reporters have to cover too many races at once and too many candidates, and so there just isn't the time and resources to fact check people's resumes. So I'm curious, do you think from now on, one of the first tasks is going to be fact checking the resumes of candidates, or or will this just be a flash in the pan and it will be business as usual?
For folks on the live stream who couldn't hear the question, it's how this episode will affect future races and vetting and how campaigns are conducted.
And the sort of fact checking well, so one thing that we've seen immediately, I thought this was funny, that on the sort of internal side, there's been this huge boom in the market for vulnerability studies, which are basically, what a candidate will do on themselves to sort of check their own record, make sure they know all the things that'll come out. So there's been a real boom in that, which I think is like a level of vetting. I think the opposition research, there's been a similar kind of jump, less publicized. So there's that. There's also been this mini boomlet of reporters kind of like doing that kind of scratching at backgrounds. I mean, Andy Ogles has been the non-beneficiary of that, right? This like stuff has come out from his background because of this renewed interest in like local scrutiny. And so we'll see, I think it depends. We have the same media ecosystem we had before Santos, right? There's like not nearly enough people digging, and the kind of, reporting that we're doing is not always that sort of fact checking of resumes. Sometimes also it's a total matter of getting lucky, or non-lucky in my case. I mean, I spent a lot of time on the college background of a different Long Island congressional candidate that cycle, because he said he went to Annapolis, which is something that you check. That's like a bell that goes off in your head, and you're like, oh, we can't just say that. We got to make sure he actually graduated from Annapolis, the military academy. Spent a long time trying to track that down, and spoiler alert, he went. So like that's what happens a lot, is that you come up empty, and so I think it's just we all have to commit to coming up empty anyway and seeing what happens.
You spoke to kind of why his personality, seemed like a natural fit for politics. You spoke to who his sort of political, not mentors, but sort of like lodestars were. Was there any kind of sense from his early life contacts and people from way back when of why he bent towards the political right instead of? So I mean, because I feel like a lot of that stuff comes out in like the foundations of like family, values and that kind of thing. Like, was there any early hint towards why he went that way?
So the question for the live stream is if there was anything in his political background as he came up that suggested he would end up on the right as opposed to somewhere else if he got into politics.
Yeah, this was a thing that there was at one point one take on Santos that even his political views were a lie, and that he was actually this like lefty and was faking being a Republican. Certainly he would change his political views to suit the audience, like we've been talking about, and I think there was a sort of level of that he's willing to change his political beliefs. That said, I think that his family, most of his family was like pretty deeply conservative, pretty religious. His mother's side in Niterói, which is the city that they're from, were often like Bolsonaro supporters. Father's side too, actually. So this like kind of tracks with the right in America. So that is not that's not so different. And also I think that there's like a draw to certainly he like followed in Trump's footsteps, right? And like there's a draw to there not being a consequence for lying for some on the right, and so that kind of pulls him over that way.
Did you consult with any like psychiatrists or like therapists like when doing your research?
Yeah. Personally, yeah. No. I did, and that actually was another bucket that I had been hoping to report on, and as I did, I learned more about this so-called Goldwater rule, which is basically, based on Barry Goldwater. There's this unbelievable, unhinged article that you guys should look up about Goldwater that is like, I'm going to butcher it, but essentially, right, that he was like not fit to be president, I think, something like that. That he because he was like psychologically unfit. And after that, everyone was like, let's like slow down. This is maybe not good to diagnose from afar. That that people took off from that rule with Trump a little bit, but mostly that is what most like working mental health professionals like abide by. So I talked to a lot of people who didn't want to be quoted. They're like, I would never do this. That being said, I think that, so from those kind of like background conversations, the one thing that I heard a lot is this, I guess, condition or issue called pseudologia fantastica, which I kind of love because of the name, and also because in the sort of minor literature about it, it just matched Santos so well and was so evocative. Basically someone who's like lying and seems to believe their own lies, which who knows? Again, I'm armchair diagnosing too. I think that Santos is many things at many times, but sometimes he does seem to be, at least on some level, kind of believing what he's saying.
The back.
How did you find, like, in finalizing this, like, where to end? It's like always something with them. So like,
Yeah.
how did you find like the not like going back of it all?
Right.
The question is how Mark found where to end. I would add to that, writing about something that was a live
Yeah.
news story as it was
Yeah.
developing and was going to publish before any kind of final resolution. How did you manage to figure out when to sort of,
Yeah.
hit
Very
send on it?
tricky. My great editor, Nick Ciani's here, and he had to rip it out of my cold, dead hands. That was basically how it ended. I like that is kind of how it ended. But partially, no, like I was grappling with this while I was writing because I knew that I would have to kind of turn it in before we got sort of resolution with Santos. Because he was indicted and there was like a trial that would not take place before the book came out under any version of like the timing. So I knew there would be more to come. I knew that at some point he was probably going to get expelled, and I probably wouldn't be able to like comment on that, which turned out to be true. He got expelled the week the book came out. So I kind of had to account for a bunch of different possibilities. And so what I did was kind of, in the end, the last chapter is kind of like forking paths. It was kind of like, here are some of the paths for Santos. And I didn't even sort of focus on Santos there, but on some other grifters, basically, or liars, and sort of like following some other people's paths and saying, perhaps Santos could end up in this way. And I think it still holds up. I think that he still has the choice that I present in the conclusion of these two forking paths. So I think it
definitely
still
holds up.
Yeah. I got lucky, but I do think it holds up at least for another year or so. And so we'll see. He has a couple of roads that he can take, and they'll be very telling ones.
Yeah, actually kind of follow-up question. Just a nuts and bolts question, which is, what was the date that they pried it out of your
There were multiple dates. There was the fake date. There was the real date. Nick's like, this is not funny. No, I mean, it is like a great story about the what a publishing company can do when they want to, about like kind of like putting the huge machinery of like printers and editors and copy editors and fact checkers to the service. And so there was another indictment in this case, right? A sort of associated one of Santos's campaign aides was indicted over Columbus Day weekend, and I was in Boston visiting some friends, and the indictment came, and I'm like calling people on the way up to like try to figure out what it meant. And reminder, the book came out in November, and I was like, Nick, what do you think? Can we get this in? And they, to their credit, they were like, yes, we can get it in. But it was literally at the printers at that time. The book was like being printed, and it was stop the presses.
I was about to shout that.
Yeah, I know. And so what they said was like, you can kind of take out the exact amount that you put in. So that's how I finished the book, was by removing like the exact character numbers that I was adding in, and I was able to sort of update slightly to get some of these indictments in. But I didn't change; those were like changing kind of details, and just like we learned a little more about some things like loans and some of Santos's particular grifts. But I left the structure of the book intact, which was a gamble. Another version of this book, the conclusion could have been like that last indictment. But my sense was that this is a bigger story than like just Santos himself. This is about sort of like American politics and just the constant, character of the grifter in America. And so I wanted to leave that structure of like the forking paths for him. And that's what I did.
In the corner there.
I'm curious, as a writer who writes both nonfiction and fiction, like what your assessment of Santos as a storyteller is. Like your experience building stories, like you felt like that helped you understand what he was doing.
The question again, for those in the live stream, sorry to keep repeating him. Mark is a very accomplished fiction writer as well, and as a storyteller of both fiction and nonfiction, how did you sort of evaluate Santos at a different level than you might have if you had one and not the other?
Right. So funnily, in that Z-Way interview that Matt mentioned, this is like his only criticism of the book. He was like, "It's effing fiction," which is just such a funny criticism because a lot of the book is about his lies, which are fiction, right? So it's like, which is fiction, your part or my part, So that was like a funny thing. But I have no idea what Santos. I don't even know if he knows that I write fiction. I was just saying that to someone before. Like, I don't think he knows anything about me. Like, he just doesn't seem interested. Which, like, go with God. But he is like a good storyteller. I mean, he is, like I said, he's very quick on his feet. And in a way that I'm sort of not. I sort of was, looking over some of these interviews that he did and sort of podcasts and stuff. And sometimes I'd be like, man, where did that come from? I mean, does everyone know the Epstein one? He said he met Epstein, and he has a whole thing about his, like, how tall Epstein is. There's just so much that he kind of just pulls out of nowhere, and he has a story about it. Steve Schwartzman, the head of Blackstone, he claims he met him and accidentally overturned a table on him. And this is like a big finance guy, so Santos was telling this story to show how like plugged in he is in finance. But like, rather than just be like, yeah, I met Steve Schwartzman, whatever his name is, he, instead of just saying that, he has this like weird line about how like, yeah, first I sat at the table and then like I, sort of got up from the table too quick and like my stomach hit the table and then it flipped over and Steve Schwartzman was like, none of this happened. Like, I never met the guy. I don't know what he's talking about. We don't have a conference room. No, I don't know. He didn't go that far. But it's, he is like an incredible storyteller. I do think that when I was writing the book, this is the first nonfiction book I've written. I wrote this collection of linked short stories like almost a decade ago now. And I've written lots of other fiction in the meantime. But I did sort of use the muscle of fiction to write this book pretty quickly, that I did all the reporting and then kind of just like funneled it in and tried to write it in this somewhat novelistic way, where it's like, I hope that it's not choppy and not sort of like, I hope it doesn't read like a traditional biography, because my idea was to write it more like a novel with this real rise and fall.
Right next to the last one. Yeah. Oh, no,
yeah, Matt, you go, and then me.
I was thinking about this when you mentioned Wolf of Wall Street and Great Gatsby. How much of this is like an only in Long Island story, or what makes it
Yeah.
a story besides the geographic?
Questions about the Long Island of it all.
The Long Island of it all. Oh, by the way, sorry. Just you made me that made me think of the Mets thing. Which do we know the Mets one?
How do we miss the Mets thing? No.
The
floor
no,
is
I mean,
yours.
just I guess I don't know how that got in my head. I was thinking of the Mohegan Sun thing, and then whatever. Anyway, Santos claims that he was a Mets fan, and once did a video doing the "Let's Go Mets" chant. Absolutely wrong, like the total wrong way. Like, what is the "Let's Go Mets" chant? Obviously. He did it like "Let's go Mets," and then this one New York Met told me that he thought that ruined their season, which like they needed no help to do. Sorry. So
but great till Santos came along.
I know. Yeah, but like I think the New Yorkness of it, the Long Islandness of it, is really crucial to this story, which is again why like I personally was so interested in it, and I was so excited to be able to. Like all I want to do ever is like tell great New York stories, and it was like amazing to get the opportunity to tell this New York story that other people wanted to listen to for once, which is not my experience typically. Long Island, just to sort of like really generalize, he comes from Queens, right, and has a real like chip on his shoulder about like looking at New York City from afar, right? He loves Manhattan, is not from Manhattan, right? And Long Island is like the same thing, right? It's like Long Island is so. It's funny. I'm working on a piece right now about, is this district can it be sort of like a bellwether for the suburbs in 2024, which is like kind of standard, political story. And I think the problem with that pitch is that Long Island is a little sui generis, and that Nassau County is sort of the birth of the suburbs, but is also so shaped by New York City, so different from other places in terms of demographics and wealth and even geography, right? With the way the water has shaped Long Island. So I do think, and he himself like loves Long Island, wants to be like associated with Long Island, even though he mostly has lived in Queens. So I do think that is like a crucial part of the story that I was really just excited to talk to all these Long Island characters from the political universe, which there's a fun chapter about his staffers in here.
Yeah, just right behind.
You know all these fake stories with him. Was there any fake story that you like, this is definitely fake, but turned out to be true?
Yeah. I'm trying to think. I mean, the Jewish one is like one that is like not described carefully, right? Like everyone's like, oh, he lied about being Jewish, and like that's not totally true. Like again, he's said different things at different times, and also there is this like family tradition that he has. Then there was one, it's kind of a sad one, but he would go to, this is like his skill in politics, right, is sort of, again, saying what the audience wants and really kind of understanding the political currents of Long Island and riding them. And so one of them during his winning year was anti-vaccine sentiment, right? This was like a big thing on Long Island, a lot of donations, a lot of organization due to like anger at COVID vaccines. And in one such gathering, he said that he had a niece who had autism, and that that sort of people were talking about autism because there's this false claim that COVID that the vaccine can cause autism. And so at first when I heard that, I was like, I wonder if that's not true. Like what a horrible thing to lie about. But it does seem it seems like he wasn't making it up. So that was one where and there was kind of like a reason why you do have to check everything. The other thing is he lies about his lies. I went down a real rabbit hole to prove that he didn't go to Horace Mann because he like continues to claim that he did in fact go there for a few months. And so I read like the yearbooks from that time period and like poured over every single page. And this is what you have to do to tell his story. I think should we do one more? Wrap up? No, we got to wrap up.
Thank you to everybody.
Thank you guys.
Marks, stick around. Get the book.
Yeah.